1987 Formula One World Championship was the 38th Formula One World Championship for drivers and the 30th Formula One World Championship for constructors, which were contested concurrently over a 16-race series that commenced on the 12th of April and ended on the 15th of November. The World Championship for drivers was won by Nelson Piquet for the third and final time. He won just 3 races, compared to his teammate and main rival Nigel Mansell with 6 wins, but Mansell had to give up the challenge when he crashed in practice for the Japanese Grand Prix and injured his back. The World Championship for constructors was won by Williams-Honda for the second consecutive year. The season also encompassed the Jim Clark Trophy and the Colin Chapman Trophy, which were respectively contested by drivers and constructors of Formula One cars powered by naturally aspirated engines. This was the first season since 1976 that Renault were absent as an engine supplier in the sport due to ongoing company restructuring. Pirelli's withdrawal from F1 at the end of 1986 meant that Goodyear was the sole tyre supplier for 1987. It was the first season since 1963 that the sport featured a standard single tyre supplier. In this season there were some team changes. Renault had withdrawn from Formula One at the end of last year, so their 3 customers had to look for new contracts. Lotus bought 1-year-old Honda engines. Ligier were due to run Alfa Romeo 4-cylinder turbo engines called the Alfa Romeo for 15T, but when driver René Arnoux compared the engines to used food, Alfa's owner Fiat withdrew from the collaboration. The team were due run with the 890T at the opening round in Brazil before debuting the 4-cylinder turbo at Imola in round 2. However, when the association with Alfa ended, it forced the team to miss Brazil while they modified their car to fit the old BMW turbo engines rebadged as Megatron supplied to the team by Arrow's team boss Jackie Oliver. Tyrrell signed a contract for Ford Cosworth V8s, preparing them for the new regulations banning turbos in 1989. AGS also made the switch to Cosworth naturally aspirated V8s. Benetton, too, signed a deal with Ford Cosworth, but for their V6 turbo which had debuted in 1986 with the Haas-Lola team, because of its specific design features that could hopefully avoid the effects of the limited turbo boost, at least more than their rivals' turbo engines. McLaren lost designer John Barnard to Ferrari, but gained the services of longtime Brabham designer Gordon Murray as the new technical director, and former Williams and Haas-Lola designer-engineer Neil Oatley. McLaren's new 1987 car would be designed by Steve Nichols. Arrows attracted former Haas-Lola aerodynamicist Ross Brawn as its new technical director and chief designer. With BMW pulling out of Formula One other than honoring the contract to supply engines to the Brabham team in 1987, Arrow's major sponsor, American insurance firm USF&G, bought the remaining supply of the BMW M12R13 4-cylinder engines and renamed them as the Megatron M12R13 engines. The FIA's ban on turbocharged engines in 1989 made the entry to Formula One technologically easier and cheaper. The first team attracted to the grid was Scuderia Coloni, a successful squad in the Italian Formula 3 Championship. They entered the Italian and Spanish Grand Prix, before participating in the full season a year later. About drivers' changes in the 1987 season. The 1982 world champion Keke Rosberg retired before this season, opening the door at McLaren for Stefan Johansson, after he got replaced at Ferrari by Gerhard Berger. Satoru Nakajima made his debut at Lotus, next to Ayrton Senna, having won 6 out of 7 championships in Japanese Formula 2. His promotion was backed by Honda. Martin Brundle and Jonathan Palmer switched teams, Brundle moving to Zakspeed and Palmer to Tyrrell. Palmer endured a more successful year, winning the Jim Clark Trophy as highest-scoring driver with a non-turbocharged car. By 1987, Osella were going at the season race by race and asking drivers to bring sponsorship or their own money. In such a construction, Gabriele Tarquini made his debut during the San Marino Grand Prix. And likewise, Franco Forini drove 3 races for the team. 1986 Italian F3 champion Nicola Larini debuted with Scuderia Coloni. He had driven for the team in F3. F3000 driver Yannick Dalmaz made his debut during the Mexican Grand Prix, and staying until the end of the season, driving a second Laris car next to Philippe Alliot. Due to poor results, AGS replaced Pascal Fabre with Roberto Marino, with 2 races left in the year. Marino had one previous experience in F1, as test driver for Lotus in 1982. Brabham driver Riccardo Patrese was given the opportunity to replace Nigel Mansell for the last race of the season, when the Williams driver was injured during qualifying for the Japanese Grand Prix. He had already been signed by Williams for 1988. 1987 F3000 champion Stefano Modena stepped in to make his debut at Brabham. In this season there was calendar changes. The Belgian Grand Prix and Monaco Grand Prix swapped places on the calendar so that the Monaco round follows the Belgian Grand Prix. The British Grand Prix was moved to the Silverstone circuit on an annual yearly basis after they signed a 5-year deal to host the Grand Prix. The German Grand Prix reverted to Hockenheim, run by the Automobilclub von Deutschland, forcing out the Nürburgring, who were run by ADAC. The Spanish Grand Prix was moved from mid-April to late September. The Japanese Grand Prix returned after a 10-year absence. It was hosted at the Honda-owned Suzuka International Racing Course on the 1st of November. The Canadian Grand Prix was originally scheduled to be held on the 14th of June but was cancelled due to a dispute between two rival breweries, Labatt and Molson, in sponsoring the race. 1987 was the first season since 1975 that there was no Canadian Grand Prix. About regulation changes, it had already been determined that turbocharged engines would be banned from 1989 on. The FIA tried to make an early switch to naturally aspirated engines appealing. Naturally aspirated engines could now have a maximum displacement of 3.5 litres, up from 3.0. The fuel limit for turbo engines was set at 195 L, while teams running with a naturally aspirated engine could carry and use unlimited amounts of fuel during a race. The turbo boost was now limited at 4.0 bar. The FIA handled this by mandating that the valves would pop off when the pressure went over the limit. This led to the turbo-powered cars producing approximately 300 brake horsepower less than the year before. However, the rate of development in areas like aerodynamics and tires was such that the leading turbo-running teams practically negated the restriction on power. The FIA banned super soft qualifying tires to eliminate the unpopular practice of having to find a clear lap on tires which were good for 2 flying laps at best. But let's go now to discover a new, epic and dramatic F1 season. The first race in April at the fast, rough and abrasive Jacarapaguá Rio Centro Autodrome in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil resulted in a dominant showing from Williams Honda with Mansell ahead of Piquet. The March team suffered a setback on race morning when it ran out of engines, and so the field was down to 22. At the start, Piquet took the lead from the fast-starting Senna, while Mansell made a bad start and had to fight his way back to third. On lap 7, Piquet suddenly went into the pits, his car having picked up paper in its radiators. He rejoined back in 11th position, leaving Senna to lead Mansell, although the British driver was soon in the pits as well to have his radiators cleared. He rejoined behind Piquet and the pair then began to climb through the field. Senna pitted because of handling trouble, and so Prost went into the lead, and when he stopped for new tyres, Senna briefly led before Piquet went back into the lead before his second stop. Prost then went ahead again and led for the rest of the afternoon, never looking threatened as he did not have a third tyre stop while his rivals Senna and Piquet did. Mansell's race was disrupted by a puncture while Senna went out with engine failure, and so Prost came home to win ahead of Piquet, Johansson, Berger, Senna and Mansell. After the season opening race in Brazil, there was a 3-week gap during which March finished building the first 871 chassis for Capelli. Osella expanded to 2 cars, with the second being run by a youngster called Gabriele Tarquini, while Brundle had the first of Zakspeed's new 871 chassis. Ligia was back in action with Megatron engine cars for René Arnoux and Piercarlo Ghinzani. In addition, there was another new team in the form of Gerard Laris Lola Ford Cosworth team, which had employed Philippe Alliot. But come the San Marino Grand Prix held at the fast Autodromo Dino Ferrari in Italy, Nelson Piquet had a huge accident at the flat-out Tamburello corner when he suffered a tyre failure during qualifying and was forbidden from racing by F1 Dr. Sid Watkins. Senna led from the start, but on the second lap at Tosa, Mansell swept into the lead and began to pull away. On lap 6, Prost found a way ahead of Senna and then clawed his way up behind Mansell and stayed there. Prost's race ended, however, on lap 15 when the McLaren suffered an alternator failure. By then Alboreto had got ahead of Senna and so was in second place, with Senna third and Patrese fourth. Mansell stopped earlier than planned for new tyres but was still ahead when everyone re-emerged from their first stops. Patrese had moved to second with Alboreto and Senna chasing. In the closing laps, Patrese dropped back because he had used too much fuel, and so Alboreto was second until he lost boost pressure and Senna went ahead again. Mansell took the flag just under half a minute ahead of Senna with Alboreto third. The high-speed circuit tour kept coming, and next was the Belgian Grand Prix at the magnificent and far Spa-Francorchamps public road circuit near Liège. The field was much as it had been at the San Marino GP a fortnight earlier, although Osella was back to one car again. Nelson Piquet was back in action after his huge crash at Imola, while Zakspeed had two 871 chassis for Martin Brundle and Christian Danner, the German having used an older car in the two previous races. Qualifying saw the two Williams Hondas at the front with Mansell on pole by nearly 1.5 seconds, while Ayrton Senna was third in his Lotus Honda ahead of the two Ferraris of Gerhard Berger and Michel Alboreto. At the start, Mansell took the lead and led Senna, Piquet, Alboreto and Prost. At the start of the second lap, Philippe Streiff lost control of his Tyrrell at Rydillen and smashed into the barriers, the impact tearing the engine from the car. Jonathan Palmer then arrived on the scene in the second Tyrrell and smashed into the wreck of Streiff's car. The race was stopped but both men were unhurt, although the Tyrrell team's cars were demolished. The race was restarted, which was good luck for Berger and home favourite Boutsen, who had collided at the bus stop chicane. This time Senna took the lead from Mansell, although halfway around the first lap Nigel tried to overtake and the two cars collided and both spun. Senna was out but Mansell was able to get going again. This put Piquet into the lead and Mansell at the back. He would continue until damage from the incident caused him to stop on lap 17, and after he retired, he marched to the Lotus pits to confront Senna, resulting Mansell grabbing Senna by the throat, and then the two drivers got into a fist fight. Both had to be separated. Second place belonged to Alboreto with Prost third, Boutsen fourth and Fobby fifth after Berger went out with an engine failure. Piquet went out with an engine failure after 10 laps and with Alboreto stopping with a broken CV joint. Prost went into the lead with Boutsen second and Johansson third, the Swede having overtaken Fobby. Stefan then closed on Boutsen and moved to second on lap 17. The pit stops changed little, but in the latter part of the race Boutsen fell behind a charged-up Andrea de Cesaris. Boutsen finally retired with a broken CV joint, which left fourth place to Eddie Cheever with Satoru Nakajima's Lotus Honda and Rene Arnoux sixth in the Ligia Megatron. There were no changes in the entry after the Belgian GP, and so it was business as usual at Monaco, where the three leading Honda engine cars were at the front as usual, with Nigel Mansell taking pole in his Williams, Ayrton Senna second in the Lotus and Nelson Piquet third in the second Williams. Alain Prost was fourth for the McLaren tag team with Michel Alboreto fifth in his Ferrari. Alboreto had a spectacular crash when he ran into the back of Christian Danner's Zakspeed on the climb after STE Devote. The Ferrari flew through the air but fortunately landed back on the track. At the start Mansell went straight into the lead, so there was no chance of a repetition of his collision with Senna at Spa. The Brazilian was second with Piquet third ahead of Alboreto, Prost and Cheever. The order at the front remained unchanged until lap 30 when Mansell slowed with a loss of boost pressure. Senna went into the lead and stayed there all the way to the flag, despite stopping for tyres. Piquet stayed second while Prost moved to third, overhauling Cheever, who ran third for much of the mid-race. In the closing laps Prost suffered an engine failure and so third place went to Alboreto. The Detroit Grand Prix was the only North American round in the middle of the European season. The entry was unchanged from the field that had raced at Monaco 3 weeks earlier, and as usual the battle for pole position was between the Honda-powered cars, with Nigel Mansell fastest on this occasion with his Williams. Just behind him was Ayrton Senna's Lotus and Nelson Piquet's Williams. Mansell took the lead at the start and began to pull away from Senna, while behind in the midfield Stefan Johansson damaged a front wing on the back of Warwick's Arrows, and Satoru Nakajima crashed into the back of Ivan Capelli's Leighton House March and then managed to collide with Adrian Campos's Minardi at the next corner. Behind the two front runners Piquet had trouble keeping Cheever behind him and eventually gave himself a puncture when he tapped a wheel and had to pit for new tyres. Cheever then had to fight to hold off Fobby, and on lap 7 the Benetton driver tried to pass and made a mess of it and ended up removing the nose of his car. Both drivers pitted, Fobby to retire and Cheever for new tyres. He rejoined at the back. This left Alboreto third ahead of Boutsen and Prost, and the only change in the next few laps was as Prost moved up ahead of the Benetton. Alboreto went out with gearbox failure and so Prost was third as the pit stops approached. During the stops Mansell had a wheel nut stick on his car and lost 10 seconds, and that meant that Senna went into the lead with Mansell second, Prost third and Piquet, who had charged up through the field, in fourth. Nelson continued his charge and overtook Prost and closed on Mansell, who was suffering from leg cramps. He eventually fell behind the Brazilian, Prost and Gerhard Berger. Senna won at his ease with Piquet second and Prost third. At the French Grand Prix held at the Paul Ricard, the battle of the Honda-powered cars was interrupted in France by a good performance from Alain Prost's McLaren tag, which qualified second to Nigel Mansell's Williams. The second row featured Ayrton Senna's Lotus Honda and Nelson Piquet in the second Williams. Mansell made a good start to lead Prost into the first corner, but on the back straight Piquet blasted ahead of the McLaren to make it a Williams 1-2 with Prost third and Senna fourth ahead of the two Benettons, Boutsen ahead of Fobby. This order did not change, although Mansell ran into trouble when he ran over debris from Johansson, who had had an accident with Andrea de Cesaris at the first corner. On lap 19 Piquet had a moment and lost second place to Prost, but during the pit stops the Brazilian managed to get ahead of both Prost and Mansell. Mansell quickly retook second from Prost and closed up on Piquet, but overtaking was another issue until Piquet made a mistake and ran wide on lap 46 and Mansell went ahead. At the second round of stops Piquet stalled in the pit lane and lost just under 10 seconds, and so Mansell was able to win. Nelson finished second while Prost and Senna were third and fourth. At the British Grand Prix, Nelson Piquet beat his Williams teammate Nigel Mansell to pole by less than a tenth of a second. Third was Ayrton Senna in his Lotus. There was disappointment for Ligia, with Piercarlo Ghinzani being excluded from the meeting after he ran out of fuel on the circuit and was then refueled and push-started by his mechanics. What was to be a classic race, Prost made a better start than both Williams drivers and took the lead, but at the second corner Piquet blasted ahead of the Frenchman and almost immediately Mansell followed Piquet through. It was going to be a straight fight between the two of them. The pace of the Williams drivers and the superiority of the Williams FW11B on high-speed tracks meant that Mansell and Piquet lapped the entire field near the end of the race. Piquet had led for most of the afternoon, but in the closing laps, with the home crowd roaring him on and having pitted for a fresh set of tyres as Piquet had decided to go the entire distance on one set, Mansell closed up on Piquet, and at Stowe Corner on lap 63 of 65 Mansell went ahead of his rival with a stunning passing manoeuvre. The pace of the two Williams cars was so furious that they lapped the entire field on a dry circuit. On the slowing down lap, Mansell ran out of fuel, and the Honda engine in his car blew up. Third place went to Senna, with fourth going to Satoru Nakajima in the second Lotus Honda, and the remaining points going to Derek Warwick and Fobby. At the German Grand Prix, qualifying resulted in Mansell beating Senna to pole with Prost third, edging Piquet to fourth. At the start, Senna took the lead with Mansell slow away, but he recovered to be second by the end of the first lap ahead of Prost, Piquet, Boutsen, Alboreto and Johansson. At the start of the second lap, Mansell went ahead, and it was clear that Senna was holding everyone up behind him. Prost went by later on the second lap, and Piquet followed on the third lap. Prost was able to close up to Mansell, and on lap 7 the Frenchman went ahead. Further back in the field the attrition rate was high, but at the front little changed until lap 19 when Prost pitted for tyres. When Mansell pitted on lap 23, Prost went ahead again. Mansell hoped to catch the McLaren, but his engine failed on lap 25, and so Piquet moved to second place while Senna pitted twice trying to solve a serious handling problem and dropped back, leaving Johansson in third place after Boutsen's Benetton had blown its engine. Prost seemed to have the race won, but with 4 laps to go an alternator belt broke and he was forced to retire. Victory thus went to Piquet with Johansson second, Senna third. The attrition rate was in fact so high in this race that only 6 of 26 starting cars finished, the lowest number since the 1984 Detroit Grand Prix. The big news at the Hungarian Grand Prix at the Hungaroring in Magyarország was that Ayrton Senna had informed Lotus that he would not be staying with the team in 1988. Team boss Peter Waugh moved quickly and signed Nelson Piquet, who was unhappy that Frank Williams would not give him clear number 1 status at Williams. Senna was going to join Alain Prost at McLaren. Qualifying for the race at Hungaroring saw Ferrari making a step forward as Gerhard Berger qualified second behind Nigel Mansell's Williams Honda. Nelson Piquet was third with Alain Prost fourth in his McLaren, while Michele Alboreto was fifth in the second Ferrari. Mansell took the lead at the start, with Berger making a slightly hesitant start which allowed Piquet to take second before Berger retook the place with a brave outside overtaking maneuver at the first corner. Piquet then lost third place to Alboreto, and so it was Mansell being chased by the two Ferraris, with Piquet fourth ahead of Senna, Prost, Boutsen and Johansson. Berger's race would be short-lived as he retired after 13 laps with differential failure. This moved Alboreto to second and Piquet to third, and the order stayed the same until Piquet overtook Alboreto on lap 29. Senna was fourth with Boutsen fifth and Prost sixth. The order remained unchanged until lap 44 when Alboreto disappeared with an engine problem, and then in the closing laps Prost moved ahead of Boutsen. On lap 71 of 76 Mansell's car lost its right rear wheel nut and he was forced to retire, and victory went to Piquet. This was a major blow to Mansell's championship hopes. Senna was second with Prost third. Nelson Piquet's fortunate win in Hungary gave him a 7-point lead in the World Championship over Ayrton Senna, with Nigel Mansell and Alain Prost 11 points behind Senna. At the Austrian Grand Prix, held at the scenic and spectacular Osterreichring, The fastest Grand Prix circuit of the year, the Williams Honda by Nelson Piquet took pole position at an incredible average speed of 255 km/h. Mansell was second with Gerhard Berger third in his Ferrari and Thierry Boutsen fourth in his Benetton Ford, just ahead of his teammate Teo Fabi. Michele Alboreto was sixth in the second Ferrari ahead of Ayrton Senna's Lotus Honda, Riccardo Patrese Brabham BMW, Alain Prost's McLaren and Andrea de Cesaris in the second Brabham. Stefan Johansson had a big fright in practice when he found a deer in the middle of the road and hit it at high speed. This destroyed the McLaren's suspension and he crashed heavily, cracking a rib in the ensuing accident. The safety of the Austrian track was becoming more of an issue, and on race day the problems were underlined again. The narrow pit straight became the center topic of the debate of safety. At the start, Piquet got away ahead of a fast-starting Fabi, but the race was stopped when Martin Brundle's speed went out of control, hit a barrier and bounced back into the middle for the track. René Arnoux and Adrian Campos collided while the two Tyrrells hit one another, and Piercarlo Ghinzani's Ligia was also out with a broken suspension. The grid was reformed and the field tried to get away again. Piquet went into the lead, but Mansell had a problem and was crawling away slowly. Berger too slowed suddenly as he tried to pass the Williams, and so there was serious congestion behind, with the result that Patrese hit Eddie Cheever, Johansson hit the back of Cheever and Brundle hit the rear of the McLaren. The track was blocked again and the race red flagged for a second time. Remarkably, most of the field was able to take the third start with only Streif missing, although Brundle, Caffey, Dana and Fabre all started from the pit lane. Prost's McLaren refused to get away, and so he jumped into the spare and joined the queue in the pit lane. At the end of the parade lap, Alboreto went into the pits to have his steering wheel fixed, and so there were 6 cars starting from pit lane. This time Senna stalled, but everyone avoided the Lotus and Piquet took the lead from Boutsen, Berger, Mansell and Fabi. At the tail of the field, Senna, Prost and Alboreto were beginning to charge through the backmarkers. Berger disappeared with a turbo failure after only a few laps, and Boutsen disappeared on lap 15 with a gear linkage which had come loose. This left Piquet and Mansell at the front with Fabi third. On lap 21 Mansell took the lead as the two Williams drivers were diving through backmarkers going down the straight leading to the Bosch curve. Once ahead, Mansell was able to keep his lead at the pit stops and win. The field was expanded at the Monza Autodrome near Milan by the arrival of the new Coloni team, fielding Nicola Larini. The Osella team expanded to 2 cars with the Swiss Franco Forini joining Alex Caffey. Piquet took pole position with Mansell a 10th behind him, but Ayrton Senna was beaten to 3rd place by Gerhard Berger's Ferrari. At the start of the race, Mansell made a good start but then missed a gear change, and so Piquet went into the lead at the first corner with Berger third ahead of Boutsen, Prost and Senna. At the start of the second lap, Berger challenged for 2nd place and Mansell closed the door, so the 2 cars collided and Boutsen moved to 2nd place with Berger 3rd and Mansell 4th. The order then remained the same until Mansell was finally able to pass Berger on lap 17. He then overtook Boutsen as well. The mid-race pit stops put Senna into the lead, and it looked as though he might be able to go without a pit stop as he had done in Monaco and Detroit. The 2 Williams Hondas were 2nd and 3rd with Boutsen behind them. Senna looked fine until lap 43 when he was lapping Piercarlo Ghinzani's Ligia and went off across a sand trap at the Parabolica. By the time he was back on the track, Piquet was in the lead. Senna tried to regain the place but his tyres would not allow him to challenge, and so they finished with Piquet winning the race. Mansell was 3rd. At the Estoril Autodrome, the Coloni team did not reappear in Portugal, but Osella continued to run a 2nd car for Franco Forini. Ferrari's progress throughout the summer months was confirmed with Gerhard Berger taking pole position ahead of Nigel Mansell's Williams Honda, Alain Prost's McLaren and Nelson Piquet's Williams. At the start Mansell took the lead from Berger, but behind them Alboreto collided with Piquet while Derek Warwick spun his arrows to avoid them, and then the rest of the field piled into the wrecks. The race was stopped, and at the restart everyone was able to start apart from Dana. Mansell went into the lead again. At the end of the first lap, however, Berger took the lead, and with Senna fighting off Piquet for third place the race began to settle down. It took Piquet until the 11th lap to overtake Senna. Mansell pressured Berger early on but then dropped away as his engine began to misfire and on lap 14 stopped on the circuit. Senna slowed and went into the pits, while Alboreto disappeared with a transmission failure. The order remained unchanged until the closing laps as Prost gradually closed on Berger and put the Austrian under pressure. On lap 68 of 70 Berger crumbled under the pressure and spun. Prost was in the lead and duly won his 28th victory, to beat Jackie Stewart's long-established record of 27 Grand Prix victories. A disappointed Berger was second with Piquet third, Fobby fourth, Johansson fifth and Chiva sixth. The Spanish Grand Prix had been moved to the Jerez circuit and the Coloni team was back in action, and with Franco Forini staying on for a third event with the Osella team, the field was up to 28 cars. The pole position was for Nelson Piquet ahead of Nigel Mansell. The two Ferraris of Gerhard Berger and Michel Alboreto were third and fourth. In the race Piquet took the lead, but Mansell dived ahead at the end of the first lap and began to pull away from the Brazilian. Senna was third with the two Ferraris and Boutsen chasing. The top five did not change for the first half of the race, with Senna at the front of a train of cars. At the pit stops Mansell was away and gone before Senna arrived, but Piquet was slower and found himself stuck in fourth place behind Senna and Prost. He challenged Prost but got it wrong and spun back to sixth place. Senna had decided to go through without a stop, and those behind him were left to battle with one another while Mansell drove on to victory. Senna's gamble did not pay off because his tyres deteriorated quickly, and eventually Piquet, Boutsen and Prost were all able to get ahead. Senna then dropped back behind Johansson as well. Piquet then made a mistake and ran wide, but Boutsen also made a mistake and spun, and so Prost was second with Johansson third, Piquet fourth, Senna fifth and Philippe Alliot sixth in his Laris Lola. The Formula One circus moved to Mexico 3 weeks after the Spanish round. The drivers were all complaining intensely about the track surface to FIA personnel, but not much could be done at this point. Mansell was on pole from Gerhard Berger second in his Ferrari ahead of Piquet. This Grand Prix was a very unusual race, and at the start Mansell made a bad start and was overtaken by Berger, Boutsen, Piquet and Prost. At the first corner Piquet and Prost tangled and both cars spun. Prost was out, but Piquet got going again with assistance from the track marshals. Mansell had moved up to third, and there were further incidents down through the field. At the front, Boutsen took the lead from Berger on the second lap with Mansell a distant third, but then the Benetton began to misfire and Berger went back into the lead and Boutsen went out with electronic injection trouble. Berger retired 6 laps later with engine failure, and with Alboreto also having disappeared, Ferrari's race was over. Mansell was thus left in the lead with Senna second and Patrese third and Piquet fourth. Then there were red flags after Warwick had a huge accident. A new grid was formed up based on the order of the cars before the crash, with the race being decided on aggregate. Piquet took the lead at the restart, but with Mansell sitting behind him there was no way he could win the race. In the closing lap Senna spun off, and so Piquet ended up in second place, having done enough to beat Patrese on aggregate. Eddie Cheever was fourth in his Arrows, with Fobby fifth and Philippe Alliot sixth. Formula One returned to Japan for the first time in 10 years, and the circus came for the first time to the twisty, very demanding Honda-owned Suzuka. An exciting World Championship showdown between Williams Honda teammates Nelson Piquet and Nigel Mansell was on the cards. However, during qualifying Mansell crashed heavily at the fast snake sweepers behind the paddock. The accident left him with severe bruising to his backbone, re-triggering an old injury, and it was decided that he should not be allowed to race. Having spent Friday night in hospital, Mansell flew back to Europe on Saturday evening. Nelson Piquet was world champion for the third time, his season-long consistency having paid dividends. Gerhard Berger took pole position in his Ferrari ahead of Alain Prost's McLaren, Thierry Boutsen's Benetton Ford and Michele Alboreto in the second Ferrari. In the race, Berger took the lead at the start and was never threatened, winning a dominant victory. This was Ferrari's first victory since the 1985 German Grand Prix. Boutsen chased Berger early on but dropped behind Senna, Piquet and Johansson. Piquet's race ended with an engine failure in the closing laps, so fourth place went to Alboreto with Boutsen fifth and Satoru Nakajima sixth. The last race of the year was at the demanding and punishing Adelaide Street Circuit in Australia. With Nigel Mansell out of action with injury after the Japanese GP, Williams did a deal with Brabham to use 1988 signing Riccardo Patrese for the final race of 1987, and Brabham took on youngster Stefano Modena as Patrese's replacement. Otherwise the field was as before. Japanese GP winner Gerhard Berger was on pole position in his Ferrari from Alain Prost's McLaren Tag Porsche, Nelson Piquet's Williams Honda and the Lotus Honda of Ayrton Senna. Thierry Boutsen was fifth quickest in his Benetton Ford ahead of Michele Alboreto's Ferrari, Patrese Williams, Stefan Johansson's McLaren, Teo Fobby's Benetton and Andrea de Cesaris's Brabham. Berger did as he had done in Japan, leading from flag to flag. He was chased initially by Piquet and Senna, but the Lotus soon fell behind Prost. After the mid-race pit stop, Senna moved to second with Alboreto third.